I really love this picture and I love this frame. And coincidentally, today I'm going to be talking about debate framing. So when a debater is framing or framing the context of the debates, what they are doing is they're talking about relevant status quo information that relates to the motion. You have to think about what context is relevant to this debate and what is most relevant to helping your side. By purposely framing the status quo in the way that you want it to look, you can make the judge look at the world in a different way. So that is the purpose of framing. And so when do we do framing? We do framing, a lot of framing, at the beginning of either the prime minister or the leader of opposition speech, the first speaker speeches. But you can also do framing within your argumentation and within your refutation. And when you do framing, either at the beginning of the first speaker speech or within your arguments or your refutations, you are improving the relevancy of your argument and you're improving the persuasiveness of your arguments. So the example motion I'd like to start with is this house would create schools for LGBTQ individuals. Basically, in this motion, you, as the proposition, want to create schools where all of the individuals, all of the students learning there are LGBTQ individuals. An effective strategy to win this debate is to frame the context at the beginning of the debate. Why do we need such a motion, and why do we need to create these schools? So as proposition, something that you could say is that LGBTQ are being bullied. But that is not persuasive enough as a framing for the debate. Instead, you should highlight that suicide is the leading cause of the death of LGBTQ individuals, and that those who survive bullying are very often left with mental damage. That is a much more serious and legitimate problem to solve than just the idea that LGBTQ people are bullied. And that is the framing that you would want on proposition. On opposition, you would want to frame this debate in the larger world. So proposition frames this debate just talking about LGBTQ individuals. But in the opposition framing, they would want to highlight how LGBTQ people have to integrate into the larger world. They have to integrate into the workforce. And therefore, they have to work with heterosexual people in the status quo. The reason why you should highlight this is that when you say that LGBTQ people have to integrate into the workforce and have to live with other people in the status quo, now you're giving context as to why you shouldn't just have them in LGBTQ schools and why they should be integrated into the public school system. So in this example motion, both the proposition and the opposition have two different framings. Neither framing is incorrect because both of those framings are explaining the status quo. But the proposition framing is a lot more narrow and focuses a lot more on LGBTQ people and how they get bullied. And opposition's framing is a lot broader and talking about the larger world. Both of these framings are true, and both of these framings are necessary to help each of those sides win the debate. So, as you can see, framing helps you make your arguments more persuasive and helps the judge understand why we need the motion or why we don't need the motion. But how do we do framing? I think one of the things you have to consider before you think about framing is who does the motion affect? Who are the actors? Because you see that when I was doing the framing about the LGBTQ individuals, I had to first think about that being the stakeholder, the actor that I needed to frame around. A few other questions you can ask yourself is, what are the structural reasons that something is true in the status quo? And what are some characterizations about the location or about the world in which the motion takes place, right? If the motion is very specific to a certain locale, like a country or a conflict, what are the characterizations of that locale, of that place? These are questions you have to ask yourself in order to be able to correctly, accurately frame the status quo. So I'll give you some examples of framing different locations because there are truisms that exist in different parts of the world. So here's an example. I come from South Korea, and the way that you could frame South Korea is you could frame it as a developed country, you could frame it as a fast-moving country, you could frame it as a country where a lot of people live very closely together, you could frame it as a country that has high technology but has a very low birth rate. You could frame all these things that are very true about the country so that you can give sort of a context for the debate. A very good example of a context for a debate surrounding South Korea would probably be about a debate motion trying to solve the low birth rate of South Korea and framing the status quo about how everybody lives so close together, about how everybody lives in the city, and because of that, the real estate prices are expensive. That helps us understand why the birth rate is so low. Another good example that you're going to have to frame all the time are elementary schools and schools in general. The way that you frame schools is very often divided into two different types of schools: public schools and private schools. And often in debates, you would frame public schools as being underfunded, less developed, giving less opportunities, and full of students that come from either the middle or the lower class. And for private schools, you would often frame them as having a lot of resources, being further developed, and having a lot of students that come from the upper and rich classes of society. Because in a general sense, between private schools and public schools, these things are true on a large scale. The reason why you would frame schools as private schools and public schools is that a lot of debate motions affect private schools and public schools very differently, mainly due to the difference of socioeconomic strata between the two types of schools. Another thing that you might frame within the debate is businesses or a single business or corporation. Very often you can frame that these businesses usually have a corporate ladder, that there are people at the top. You could frame that businesses often care mostly about profits and try to lower costs as much as possible. And the framing of the characteristic of the business and the location of the business will help understand the debate. I want to leave you with one last example. This is a very simple motion, but I think framing is especially important in this motion. The motion is, this house would ban junk food. And when you're framing this motion, either on proposition or opposition, you probably want to ask yourself these questions. Why would we ban junk food? Why do people like junk food? Who eats junk food? Is junk food cheap or expensive? What is junk food good for? And once you answer these questions, you'll understand the status quo reasons as to why we might want to ban it or why we might not want to ban it. For example, proposition can state that in the status quo, there is an obesity epidemic in certain countries, such as the United States, or maybe in the UK and other countries. They might state that due to this obesity in a lot of these countries, a lot of people are passing away or dying prematurely, right? Opposition might point out that people eat junk food, or people today are stressed out, or people today eat junk food because they enjoy it. Or the opposition might prove that junk food very often is quick and that it's a cheaper alternative to certain organic foods. So that framing either gives proposition reasons to ban junk food, or it gives oppositions reasons not to ban junk food. So yeah, even in a simple motion such as this house would ban junk food, once you ask yourselves questions about the framing and do the framing, you've given yourself the reason why your team should win and why your team's arguments are relevant. So that is my simple lecture on framing. Framing is just talking about things that are true in the status quo, that are relevant to the motion, and that are relevant to the debate side that you are advocating for. And we really need to frame because by framing, we improve the relevancy of our arguments, and we improve the persuasiveness of our arguments. Without problems in the status quo, or without explaining the status quo, we can't ask and advocate for change. Or without defending the status quo, or explaining how the status quo can be solved in different ways, it's hard to advocate against the motion. So framing is super important in debates and will win you debates in the future. So that's all from me today. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.